January 1887. 63 degrees below zero, and 9 out of 10 cattle on the northern plains freeze or starve in a single winter. Shorthorns and longhorns collapse by the thousands, yet as the snows finally thaw, clusters of white-faced Herefords stand defiant among the carcasses. Why did one breed survive when others perished? The answer will rewrite everything you thought you knew about the Great Die-Up and reveal how a single trait changed the fate of the American West forever. The first blizzard hit the northern plains on November 22, 1886, sweeping across Montana, the Dakota Territory, and Wyoming with little warning. Winds howled at 40 miles per hour, driving snow until it buried the open range beneath layers of crusted drifts. By morning, cattle that had wandered too far from shelter froze where they stood. Ranchers watched as the temperature plunged, the air so cold it stabbed at the lungs. That winter had followed a summer of drought and wildfires. Grass was already scarce. By December, the snow deepened. Each new storm pressed the herds against barbed wire drift fences, hundreds of miles of steel meant to control movement, but now acting as deadly barriers. Cattle, desperate to escape the wind, drifted south in great waves, only to pile up against these fences, trampling each other in the dark, suffocating mass. When the wind shifted, some animals broke through and vanished into coulees and river bottoms, where the snow lay even deeper. Official weather logs from Bismarck and Dodge City recorded temperatures dropping to minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit in early February 1887. Unofficial reports from ranchers claimed readings as low as minus 63 degrees Fahrenheit, though no government thermometer ever confirmed such a number. Still, the cold was relentless. For weeks, the sun barely warmed the surface. Snow crusted so hard that cattle cut their legs trying to reach the grass below. Some wandered blindly, their hides caked with ice, their breath freezing in the air. Across the open range, the devastation mounted. In Custer County, Montana, ranches lost up to 95% of their herds. By March, the assessment rolls showed that 80 ranchers had vanished from the books in just 2 years. The Texas Panhandle sent 400,000 hides to Dodge City by June, a grim tally of the dead. The landscape itself seemed to turn against both animal and man. Drifts climbed fence posts and buried coulees, rivers filled with carcasses, some frozen upright where they fell. Even the hardiest cattle, shorthorns and longhorns that had survived countless prairie storms, collapsed by the thousands, unable to find shelter or food. By late February, the storms finally eased. A Chinook wind swept across the plains, melting snow and revealing the true scale of the disaster. Carcasses lay scattered for miles, heaped in gullies, pressed against wire, or sprawled in open fields. The open range, once teeming with life, had become a graveyard. Yet among the devastation, a question lingered. How had any animal survived such a winter? The answer lay not only in the fury of the weather, but in the hidden differences between the cattle themselves, a mystery that would become clear only as the survivors stepped out from the thaw. Ledger books from ranches across Montana, Dakota Territory, and Wyoming began to fill with grim tallies as the snow receded. County assessors, pressed for answers by anxious banks and investors, counted losses that defied belief. In some districts, 9 out of every 10 cattle were gone. Custer County's record showed herds reduced by 95%. The assessment rolls shrank by dozens of ranches, names erased by a single winter. Newspapers printed columns of numbers. 400,000 hides shipped to Dodge City by June, a mountain of evidence for the scale of the disaster. In the Texas Panhandle, reports described entire outfits losing 3/4 of their stock. The Diamond C and Bar CC ranches, once sprawling empires, now faced bankruptcy. Montana's Open Range, which had supported 200 ranchers before the storms, listed only 120 2 years later. Shipments of cattle to eastern markets dropped by 1/3. Yet amid these statistics, a puzzle took shape. Scattered in the ledgers and news clippings were hints of survivors, herds that seemed to fare better than the rest. Some accounts, written in a rancher's careful hand, noted that certain groups lost only 1/4 or 1/3 of their cattle. In rare cases, survival rates were said to be 3 or even 4 times higher than the surrounding herds. The numbers were never consistent, and the evidence was often anecdotal, buried in letters or second-hand reports. But the pattern was difficult to ignore. One observer, tallying the dead after the thaw, wrote of finding clusters of white-faced cattle still standing among fields of frozen black and roan carcasses. The press began to speculate about a breed apart, animals that had endured where others had failed. But the data was patchy, and skepticism remained. Many ledgers made no note of breed at all, just columns of losses and a final brutal sum. The question lingered. Was there something different about the survivors, or was it luck, shelter, or some quirk of the land? With so many variables, overgrazing, fences, drought, and the relentless cold, no single explanation fit every case. Still, the rumor of a breed that could withstand the worst winter on record began to circulate. Ranchers and reporters alike wanted to know, what set these cattle apart? The answer would require more than numbers. It would demand a closer look at the animals themselves and the traits that might have turned the odds in their favor. Hereford cattle stood apart from their rivals not by luck or shelter, but by the very design of their bodies. Each Hereford wore a dense, curly coat, thicker and more textured than the smooth hides of the Shorthorns or the slick, patchy hair of the Longhorns. This outer layer trapped pockets of warm air close to the skin, forming a natural barrier against the wind that swept across the northern plains. Underneath, a layer of fine, wool-like underfur added insulation, slowing the loss of body heat even as temperatures dropped well below zero. Ranchers who examined survivors in the spring noticed the difference to the touch. Hereford hair, tight and springy, resisted the wet and cold, while other breeds' coats lay flat and froze solid, offering little defense. The Hereford's frame added another line of protection. Stockier and lower to the ground than their competitors, these cattle carried their weight close to the earth. Their bodies were broad, with deep chests and strong shoulders. A typical mature Hereford bull stood just over 4 feet at the shoulder, but could weigh as much as 1,800 pounds. This low center of gravity made it harder for the wind to topple or disorient them, and the sturdy bones in their legs and hips helped them break through drifts or crusted snow. Where taller, narrower breeds sometimes became trapped or injured in deep snow, Herefords plowed through, using their bulk to push aside obstacles. Hair density studies from later decades would confirm what ranchers saw firsthand in 1887. Herefords grew more hairs per square inch than most other beef breeds, especially in winter. The shape of each hair, curled and slightly hollow, helped trap heat, while the compact build reduced the amount of exposed surface area. In practice, this meant less energy lost to the wind, and more reserves left for movement and foraging. Weight distribution also played a role. The Hereford's mass was balanced over short, powerful legs, spreading their weight evenly and reducing the risk of breaking through thin ice or getting stuck in snowdrifts. When storms drove the herds across the open range, these cattle navigated the uneven ground with fewer injuries. Their broad heads and thick necks allowed them to brace against gusts, keeping their noses low to the ground where the wind was weakest. While other breeds shivered and weakened as the blizzards dragged on, Herefords conserved heat, their coats beaded with frost, but rarely soaked through. The wind might strip the top layer of snow from their backs, but the undercoat stayed dry, preserving crucial warmth. With every storm that passed, the physical defenses of the Hereford proved less a matter of chance than of adaptation, an armor shaped by centuries of breeding for hardiness in harsh climates. These advantages set the stage for the next test: how the survivors would find enough food to last until spring. Hereford cattle faced the same deadly snow crusts and empty grasslands as every other breed, but their survival drew on instincts and efficiencies shaped long before the blizzards of 1886. Unlike Shorthorns and Longhorns, Herefords did not simply paw at the surface or wait for a break in the weather. They lowered their wide, muscular heads and drove them into the icy crust, using the flat, broad forehead as a battering ram. Ranchers and hands, riding in battered ledgers or recalling the spring thaw, describe the way white-faced cattle would push through layers of snow, breaking open the frozen barrier to reach what little grass remained below. This was not luck or random chance. It was a learned behavior, repeated year after year on the windswept plains of England and carried across the Atlantic. The shape and strength of the Hereford's head played a role. Forehead bones were dense and slightly domed, distributing force from repeated blows against the snow. Their short, thick necks gave them leverage, letting them dig where other cattle hesitated or failed. In the aftermath of the die-up, ranchers noted that the survivors were often the ones who kept moving, kept searching, and kept working at the crust until they found something to eat. This instinct to forage with the head, rather than just the hooves, meant more Herefords stayed on their feet through the worst of the winter. Metabolism mattered just as much as muscle. Herefords had a reputation, even before the die-up, for thriving on less. Agricultural bulletins and later United States Department of Agriculture studies would echo the same finding, that Herefords could maintain body heat and weight on about 20% less feed than their rivals. While Shorthorns and Longhorns burned through precious fat reserves and weakened quickly, Herefords converted every mouthful of hay or grass more efficiently. Their bodies stored energy in dense, even layers, minimizing waste and maximizing warmth. When the snow cut off supply, this thrift made the difference between standing and falling. Historical notes from ranches in Wyoming and Montana observed that Herefords, even after weeks of cold and hunger, showed fewer signs of muscle loss or lethargy compared to other breeds. Their movements stayed purposeful, their coats remained springy, and their eyes alert. Feed conversion was not just a matter of economics, it became a matter of life or death. In a winter when every extra pound of flesh counted, Hereford's ability to stretch limited forage meant more animals survived until the spring thaw. Behavioral edge and metabolic thrift combined to give Herefords a decisive advantage. The cattle that broke through the crust and made the most of every blade of grass did not just survive the die-up. They set a new standard for what ranchers demanded from their herds. As the numbers from the thaw came in, and as the stories of white-faced survivors spread, the economic landscape of the plains began to shift in ways that would ripple for decades. Banks called in loans as the losses mounted. By spring, the so-called Shorthorn aristocracy, once the proud rulers of the northern range, stood on the brink of ruin. Ranches that had counted their wealth in tens of thousands of head now faced ledgers filled with red ink. The Swan Land and Cattle Company, the largest of them all, saw its books slashed nearly in half. Before the storms, Company records boasted over 100,000 cattle. By the next audit, the tally had dropped to 57,000. Board members in distant London demanded answers, and managers in Wyoming struggled to explain how a single winter could wipe out fortunes built over decades. Auction notices in regional papers reflected the new desperation. Bulls that fetched a few $100s before the die-up now sold for prices that bordered on the fantastic. One Hereford bull, imported from England and touted as a survivor, was recorded at a sale price of $5,000, a sum that would have bought a ranch outright a few years earlier. Letters and reports from the Swan Company's headquarters told the same story. The old herds could not be rebuilt with shorthorns or longhorns. The only animals worth bidding for were the white-faced survivors, whose reputation for hardiness spread as quickly as the news of the disaster. Ranchers who had dismissed Herefords as a novelty now scrambled to buy breeding stock, hoping to fill pastures with cattle that could withstand whatever the next winter might bring. The collapse of the old order was not just a matter of numbers. It was a reckoning, a forced admission that biology, not pedigree, would decide who survived on the open range. When the last of the snow melted in March 1887, the plains gave up their dead. Carcasses lay everywhere. Black, roan, and dun hides collapsed in tangled heaps, their bodies stiff, where the wind had driven them against wire and into frozen gullies. The air hung heavy with the stench of decay, a silence broken only by the caw of crows and the distant howl of wolves. In this wasteland, a handful of cattle still stood. Their faces, white as chalk, caught the weak spring sun. A rancher riding out to count what was left wrote in his battered diary, "Found a dozen white-faced cattle standing among 100 dead. They broke through the crust and lived." The survivors moved slowly, their red coats matted but their eyes alert. Where the ground was bare, hoofprints pressed deep into the thawing earth, tracing paths to patches of grass no other animal had reached. The contrast was stark. White-faced Herefords, battered but alive, surrounded by the remains of breeds that had once dominated the range. For those who witnessed it, the scene burned itself into memory. Letters sent east described the same tableau: red and white cattle, heads lowered, grazing among a sea of loss. In the months that followed, ranchers and investors pored over their ledgers, searching for answers. The numbers told a story that the spring thaw had already revealed. Herefords, once a curiosity, now stood as proof against the odds. Over the next 75 years, their descendants would come to rule the Western Range, a living legacy born from a single, unforgettable season of survival. Even now, livestock genetics and climate resilience shape the future of global food security. With weather extremes intensifying, the search for breeds that can adapt is urgent. The survival of the Hereford isn't just a tale of the past. It's a reminder that nature rewards adaptation, not tradition. In every pasture today, that lesson still unfolds. Share your thoughts below and join the conversation.